Hey everyone, Phobos here, coming out with another build guide, and this is the official guide for the tri or quad Freezing Pulse Totem Ascendant. So I've already gone over quite a few Freezing Pulse guides previously for 2.6, and I think this is going to be the first one for 3.0. All the other builds still work, but I wanted to try out Ascendant in 3.6 due to the changes that they made to the Hierophant Ascendancy or Ascendant node here. And I'm going to be just going over the build in a lot of detail here, why I picked Ascendant, what I think about it compared to the other versions you can go, which are pretty much like Inquisitor, actual Hierophants. You can go Assassin, it's not really that good, but I'd say like Elementalist and Inquisitor and Hierophant are probably the three other options you could take this build. So I'm going to be comparing it to those, and yeah, that's pretty much going to be the point. It's going to be like why you would want to play Scion as opposed to those. So first though, I'm just going to go over some basics about the build, just in case anybody who hasn't watched all the previous videos, they can get like a little bit of a refresher. So we'll go over the links first. So faster casting, added cold, freezing pulse, increased critical strikes, controlled destruction, cold penetration. Now, you actually drop Cold Pen, which sounds surprising on the 6th link, but that's just because added cold is buffed quite substantially from 2.6, and the Freezing Pulse has like 150%, where is it here? It has like a 125% effectiveness of added damage. So it's actually turns out to sim better than Cold Pen. So you'd use that in the 5 link. But and then the other slots, we have a spell totem here, faster casting, freezing pulse, and elemental focus. The reason why we have this is because due to the Hierophant Ascendancy node, which you can see right here, we get an extra totem in our helm. So like what some people do is they feel like they need to put all the totems in their helm or whatever, or they feel like they don't need, like they'll just run whatever chest. Like yeah, I guess you could run like a combs and then just put all your totems in the helm for more survivability, but that's like super kind of expensive, and your average person isn't going to be able to do that anyways. So what I like to do is I just get like a soul mantle, have the totems in the soul mantle, and then have an extra totem in the helm, and it provides a substantial bit of extra damage. It's honestly probably the highest damage node, I would say, out of all the Scion Ascendant options here, because you're getting like an entire another totem. Right now it's only on a 4 link, but basically what you would do is ideally you would use an Essence of Horror on this helm. Well, to craft a helm, because you couldn't use it on this helm. It would delete the properties, or you'd have to scour it first. But and you'd hope to get decent life and a couple good resists, and then you'd have the 30% more elemental damage to things that are socketed in there. So your freezing pulse would get that buff, and right now it's at like 43k, like 44k, and your primary one is at like 71k. If you get some power charges, let's see if we can get some charges really quick. I'm gonna take this enfeeble off with the flask, so that okay. So 106 and 63, and that's with the what do you call it? The Shaman's Dominion buff. That's why you saw the number change there. So the damage is quite substantial, and that's not even taking into account Frostbomb, your Curse. This is minus 20. This is minus 43 cold, minus 20 cold. My boots are minus 10 cold because you never kill anything, so you pretty much always have this buff. And if you have your Sulfur Flask activated, that's even more damage. You can also run a Diamond Flask, which would be more damage. You could replace this with a Diamond Flask if you want. You could replace one of these with a Diamond Flask. So yeah, you can get kind of crazy with the flasks, but you can get a lot more damage that way. And also, I'm planning on getting the Pandemonious for this eventually, but I haven't really found one. Or I'll maybe just buy like the initial form and upgrade it with the Blessing of Tull, but yeah, I haven't found one right now, so that would be an extra, I think, 20% damage taken to targets that are chilled, which you're going to be able to chill most things. I'm gonna have to do some more experimenting once I get one in terms of the bosses, because obviously you're going to be able to clear trash pretty well with this build, just as it is, even on like a 5 link or something. So the only real use for that neck would be the blind on the trash or the bosses, and like the 20% basically more damage or 20% pen of their cold resistance on the bosses. But in order to get that, they need to be chilled. So I'm gonna have to see if this build can at least chill. I'm pretty sure it can pretty much chill at least like all the tier 15 ones, the ones that can be chilled. I think there are some guardians that can't be chilled and stuff like that. So you'd obviously use a different neck for those fights, but you should still be able to chill all the other bosses, even if you can't freeze them. You used to be able to freeze everything in the game pretty much except stuff that could not be frozen, but you could even freeze like Rift Lords or Breach Lords rather in certain circumstances. But yeah, now it's kind of out the window because they doubled everything's HP. But yeah, so that's gonna be the next slot upgrade for these. Some people on softcore they'll use like the kick is our rings and they'll just remove the warding from here. I find that you just lose kind of too much HP though, and this is definitely a build where it's easier to do that for though, because you don't have any other unique rings that you really want to use. You could use the rings from Hydra, I guess, if you're on softcore. You could maybe skip a first snow and put 2 of those in, or you could just keep the first snow and use those, and you'd have like a ton of projectiles come off each totem. I find that to be rather unnecessary though. They do give a lot of damage, but you're just giving up a lot of survivability, and it makes your resist very hard to get if you're only getting like 30 cold res on the rings implicit. So just something to keep in mind. Winds of Change, don't need to use these, but I like to scrounge up whatever projectile speed I can. Honestly, before you get the Pandemonious neck as well, another good option that has projectile speed that I was reminded of due to these is a Kawi Ward neck, or you can do the upgraded version. I think it's the Kawi Charge. But either way, if you don't need the resist, that neck is definitely a good option because it's a solid 30% projectile damage and 30% projectile speed, which is always really good for the build. You just lose a little bit of health, so you get some strength, but it doesn't really make up for having a rare neck. Belt is pretty standard, and boots. So the main thing I want to talk about with boots is just getting the enchants. So there's a couple enchants you can get. This is probably the best one for sure, I'd say. This is an Uberlab enchant, and since you never kill anything, you always have the pen up, like I was saying earlier. You can also get a added damage. I think it's 1 to 160 lightning damage if you haven't killed recently. That's also pretty decent. The second best one would probably be the crit chance. I think it's like 120% critical strike chance if you haven't killed recently, or if you haven't crit recently, I think it is. And that works really well with this build because you actually don't use Orb of Storms. That enchant is decent for other versions of this build, but when they use Orb of Storms, obviously, to get power charges, then you're critting. So that means that you're not gaining the buff during that like 4-second period where you crit. So it's not a terrible enchant, obviously, but it's better for Scion than it would be for other classes. Um, and yeah, I'm pretty sure that's all the gear. So I'll just go over the wands really quick. Right now we're using dual wands. These are pretty decent ones, but they're not like insanely good. Um, Voids would be better than this right now, but Voids are kind of hard to come by. Ultimately, though, I really think that the best thing you're going to be able to get a hold of is, or the best combination that you want to try and get a hold of, is a shield and a scepter. Right now, I'm trying to find a good scepter or a good dagger. The thing about the dagger is you lose out on a lot of cast speed, but if the dagger is really GG in other ways, then it's quite good to use a dagger. Obviously, the reasons you want to either use a dagger or a scepter are for shield charge or whirling blades because they're a vastly superior movement skill to flame dash. But I had something in here. I was actually like a shield in here I wanted to kind of show. Yeah, so this is what I was thinking of using for now. It's a pretty decent shield. Once I get like some other decent one hand, I haven't really been able to find one that I like, so it's like a reasonable price. But yeah, so you can definitely use other movement skills. And I guess we can get into the links next. So we already went over the Helm links. Now the one link that this build is missing is it's missing, what was it, Vol Haste, yeah. So normally you just throw like Vol Haste in here and you'd have increased duration, lightning trap, Vol Haste. But what happened is because the colors on these boots are weird because they're armor boots, some of my other links got kind of messed up. So I don't really have the links properly set up here, but these boots are kind of like too good to give up. So I'm just kind of like making do, and I'm probably going to drop one of these Arcane Surge setups to make room for what I need. But I'm not really exactly sure if I want to drop the Frost Bomb one yet, but that's probably the one I'll be dropping. So as you can see, I have Frost Bomb linked to Increased Duration and Arcane Surge, which is pretty good, but you really don't even need those two links. Increased Duration is nice, not only for Arcane Surge, but just for Frost Bomb, because you're mainly using it for the debuffing effect and not the actual damage. So, and I just tossed Arcane Surge on it because I was going to put it with the duration anyways, and Arcane Surge benefits from the duration, and it's just another way to proc Arcane Surge. The primary way I proc it though is with Flame Dash, and I have increased duration, faster casting, Flame Dash, and Arcane Surge. This is the one I think is gonna stay, although I might change it to a different movement skill. So if I do that, then obviously things are gonna get shifted around. But so if I were to change it to like Shield Charge, then this would be a red, and then this would be a green, and then it would be increased duration and Arcane Surge as well. Or same thing with like Whirling Blades, it'd be green green there. So that's like a link that you're probably gonna want your movement stuff in because it has the increased duration and that benefits the surge. And then yeah, we already went over that. Right now I have a Rallying Cry in here, and then my two auras. So the two auras that I'm using are Discipline and Clarity. Clarity, it's gonna just depend on like how much mana regen you have. See, I have kind of terrible rings here that ideally should have more mana regen and probably some flat mana on them. But pickings are slim in the beta, so these are the rings that I have. And because of that, I need to run a higher level Clarity than I would like to. But obviously you want to use the lowest level you can get away with, and you can kind of just fiddle with that yourself. Clarities are really cheap to buy anyways. You don't have to scour them. You can just get a bunch of them and get them to different levels, see which one you like more. They level really quick because you're not really going to need to get them to a high level most likely. And Discipline, obviously just extra ES. I did have Herald of Ice in this build, but you don't actually get to use like the active portion of the Herald of Ice skill with like the explosion triggering thing, and it's basically just the added damage. And despite the fact that added damage is really good with Freezing Pulse because of the damage effect from this bonus, it's still a small amount of added damage, and I just didn't think it was worth it for the amount of space on my mana it took up. So I ended up dropping it, but you can use it if you want. You can also get like aura reduction to use it more efficiently if you know, and still have a decent amount left over for Mind Over Matter. But this build does run Mind Over Matter, so that's why I kind of want more mana free. In terms of actually mana stuff, Rallying Cry actually is super helpful with maintaining your mana because it gives you quite a bit of flat mana regen in addition to the clarity. And I think I went over most of the links. I'm probably going to try and squeeze a frenzy in here somewhere. And that's just because it's very easy to keep up frenzy, I find, with this build because you're not casting anything for power charges. You could also put like an arcane surge setup in the frenzy setup possibly. You could do like GMP frenzy arcane surge maybe. Um, yeah, and that's a really easy way to keep up frenzy charges. Um, because just placing totems gives you power charges. And I think that's pretty much it. You can see I have a weapon swap here, but that was kind of like before I took the Hierophant Ascendancy. So normally you take the Hierophant first, but this character got a point reset, and then I decided to take Assassin first. So I could just allocate points from the start of Shadow. So that's how that went down. But so now I guess I'll get into a little bit about the damage values and why you may want to pick this over some of the other candidates. So, you see the base damage values right here, and then I think I already showed you them, right, with everything. Yeah, 106k, 63k, and then obviously still dependent from the flasks. Now, we're gonna start here with the obvious node, right? So I think Hierophant is by far the best thing you could take as Scion because it gives you a whole extra totem, but more importantly, it gives you the 50% chance to gain a power charge. And this is very underrated because I think a lot of people in their mind, they'll just be like, oh, well, it's kind of like negligible, right? Because you would just be using Orb of Storms anyway. And now with Arcane Surge, that honestly does, it's a little bit better of an argument because you you want something that you're going to be spamming to have Arcane Surge on, but once you get a movement skill like once you get like a real movement skill like Shield Charge, you're probably gonna be fine with that anyways. Like right now, it's a little bit annoying because Flame Dash only has 3 charges, and most of the time you're gonna get it procced. But in the event it doesn't get procced, it's kind of like annoying, and then you have to rely on other sources of Arcane Surge like the Frost Bomb or whatever. So I can see why people just want to have like a Orb of Storms and then throw the Arcane Surge in there with the Power Charge on crit and stuff. But this does make it really easy to navigate difficult maps while keeping your charges up. Um, because a lot of cases, especially now that like just survivability is down across the board and they haven't really changed monster damage, it's just a lot harder to survive in the game in general. And getting close to some of these mobs, especially when you're running like red maps with multiple damage mods, is just way too sketchy. Um, and it's not so much getting close to them as like if your totems have already casted on them, then they're frozen, right? But you run into this issue with this build where you end up doing so much damage that when you cast the totems in front of you, they will pretty much just decimate the packs very quickly, right? And it's difficult to actually put the totems down in front of you to protect you and then walk up and actually use Orb of Storms, because by the time you use Orb of Storms, the mobs are actually dead most of the time. So what that leads to is that leads to when you a playstyle where when you're trying to refresh your Orb of Storms, you kind of like run not into the pack, but you kind of run closer than you normally would and drop the Orb of Storms, and you're very vulnerable during this time, especially due to stuff like titty bitches. If they like happen to off-screen you or stuff that like flickers on you all at once, things can get a surround on you, and you don't really have any totems down in this scenario um, to protect you. So yeah, it can be a bit sketchy. And one thing you can do to kind of like help that is like as you're kind of running forward, you put a totem down behind you. So it's like the totem's gonna fire, but you're probably gonna get your orb off before, and as long as it doesn't obliterate the pack in one shot, you're probably gonna be able to refresh your charges. So obviously, there's a bit of like a little bit of a learning curve to playing that style with the Orb of Storms, and it's not really that hard, but you'll get used to it if you keep playing totems. But it can still leave you vulnerable, I feel like, and is a bit a pain in the ass. So as somebody that's played totems for a long time, the quality of life that this node gives just seems really beneficial. And I've played kind of a decent, like a lot on this. I think this character's 89, so I played a decent amount with this. And I also played in the last iteration of the beta before they did the wipe a freezing pulse character as well. And I was only with the 4 ascendancy points, but I took Hierophant with them just to kind of test out how it felt in maps. So I've been playing it for quite a bit, and it feels a lot better than, having to use Orb of Storms. So obviously you're giving up a bit of damage, but the convenience factor is really high. And on single target, it's like you're not really giving up that much damage because you have the additional totem in your helm. And on top of that, you have 25% increased mana, which increases your mana regen and gives you more mana from Ohm. And then 10% of that goes to your energy shield, so it's easier to get a higher ES value even after all the ES nerfs that have come through. And obviously I don't have optimal ES because I don't have ES on my pieces or even percent ES or anything like that, and my boots are not ES based. Ideally they would be ES based, so I'm not using a shield. So you can actually get your ES up quite a bit through using Hierophant from the Ascendant, and it's a really good defensive option. Now the next ascendancy, or part of the ascendancy, I guess you could say. I think, in my opinion, the real choice here is between Assassin, which I decided to go, and what do you call it? Deadeye. Now, Assassin is going to be straight up more raw damage, right? Because you have base crit, and then the 40% crit multiplier against enemies that are on full life is actually quite substantial. You don't really benefit from the power charge gain on hit against enemies that are full life because you're already generating charges just by placing down totems. And with the percent they increase the power charge, or the with the percent that they increase the chance to gain a power charge by, you don't really need any alternate form of uh, gaining charges. So the 20% here is a bit redundant, but the 40% crit multi against enemies that are on full life and the 1.5% chance to critical strike are pretty decent damage. And then Path of the Shadow allows you to actually start Shadow, which is, I think, it's pretty important. But then again, like, you could obviously say that if you go, let's say you go Deadeye, right? Then you would just start Path of the Templar, right? And you wouldn't have quite as much cast speed, which is more damage, but it would be like roughly the same, I would say, because you'd get the spell damage at least, and then you get the elemental damage here. So yeah, it wouldn't be quite the same, but it would be close enough. So that's why so that's why deciding to go Deadeye isn't like super terrible at all. Deadeye is like a bit more, I guess you could say, utility, but it also really helps your damage as well because the Pierce is obviously redundant, but the projectile speed is really good on Freezing Pulse, as I'm sure a lot of you know, because it basically allows it to maintain its damage for longer as it's passing through all these targets. So it's kind of like a pseudo damage buff, even though it's not really showing up on the tooltip or anything. Um, I guess a counter argument could be that typically once you get it past a certain point, though, it's really not going to benefit you that much because the damage fall off at the end does get fairly substantial, and like you're probably going to be clearing packs anyways, so it's kind of like a bit like just debatable how good this node actually is. I'm probably going to respec at some point just to mess around with this, just to see if I notice the projectile speed difference to be substantial or not. It's also, like, I guess a good option if you're lacking on projectile speed, which right now this build sort of is, because we really only have the Winds of Change, and I don't have any on my wands right now. If you're going to use wands and you're not using voids, projectile speed is an insane stat to have, but again, just have some pickings from the beta, so. You can also use the Cowrie Ward, like I was saying. So yeah, there's kind of a lot of options to get prod speed, but if you're pretty low, then Deadeye can be quite good. And then obviously the projectiles gain damage as they travel further. This is nice. It's probably not going to result in too much damage for you normally because you're going to be placing the totems pretty close to the pack. And they might kill like 2 packs, but they're probably not going to go to 3 packs or anything like that. And they'd probably kill the second pack anyway, even without this node. So, because it's just increased damage and not more. So not super big deal there. And then skills fire an additional projectile. This is an interesting one. There's a couple things you can do with this. You can obviously just run it like I have it, and take this node, and then you gain an additional projectile. So from each totem, you would basically be casting 6 projectiles, because it's like 1 from the original, and then 2 from each of the first nodes, and then 1 from this. So 6 in total. Then you could combine it with those Hydra rings if you wanted to get really crazy, or you could actually subtract the first snow, and then you'd have 4 projectiles instead of 5, which would still be great spread. So you can kind of mess around with that depending on what your needs are and how you think the build is clearing. Um, so it's nice just to have the extra flexibility. But on a build that's already running 2 first snows, I'm not really sure the extra projectile is all that substantial. I've watched, like, I think Pox has made a Ascendant guide, and I've watched some gameplay with his totems, and I don't feel like it's just insane to have this node or anything like that. So, but it's definitely like viable, and it's fine. It's just kind of like a difference of preference. And the good thing about both the Assassin and the Deadeye is that they both have Dex nodes leading into them, which is really important because Dex is a stat that these builds struggle with quite a bit, getting from the tree and getting from gear. So just having these Dex nodes here is probably going to save you like an extra point. So really, like playing Scion is essentially like granting you 6 points because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you're gaining essentially a point from not having to allocate a 30 stat node on the tree or worry about getting stats on your gear or something, you know, in an awkward place. Yeah, so that's pretty much an explanation on the ascendancy ascendant tree. Now, in terms of the actual skill tree, as you can see, like I said, we basically went through. We started through Shadow because we have Path of the Shadow. Obviously, you can't start through Shadow. Normally, if I level this character, I start um, through the mana right here, and then eventually I would respec out of everything once I got Path of the Shadow. So that's how I would do it. And then obviously, if you choose to go Ranger, you're not really going to start from the Ranger because, well, actually, you could if you were still you could do a build where you start from the Scion, and then you also start from the Ranger because you don't need to like deallocate the Scion starting point to start allocating points from another class's tree. You can also just come out Scion obviously anytime you want, and then also come out of this. So this is a decent place to pick up some extra projectile speed for sure. But I think most likely what I would have done is I would just nix a lot of the stuff at the Scion start, unless I got really good jewels. These jewels are kind of shitty. If I got like really GG jewels, I'd probably keep the Scion start. But before that, I would just nix it and go from the Templar start, which you would get by just coming here instead of getting this one or this one. And then in terms of the tree, it's pretty much the same as the other trees. Obviously, there's a difference here in where Heart and Soul is placed. I kind of like the change. But there's nothing really that substantial otherwise. There's some jewel sockets you can pick up. I have the 2 for the first node. There's basically 2 more that you're going to get. The next place this build is going is down to this health. And you probably look at the health of the build and go, oh, that's kind of a bit low. Well, that's because we are missing these health nodes right here. And once we pick those up, we'll clear 4,500 pretty easily, probably be at like 46, 4,700. And my gear is still kind of trash, so you can upgrade there as well. And if you get a shield, you'd obviously have life on it, ideally. So that's another thing. So you can get pretty close to 5k health, I would say, using a shield and taking all the health nodes, especially if you pick up some of these jewel sockets. The reason why I don't have these is just because it's beta, and I'm just mostly testing to see if the damage is there on the Scion, and it is. But yeah, I pretty much allocate all the damage nodes first. And keep in mind that we're missing points on the beta. Right now I'm level 89, but we're essentially missing, I'd say, at least like 5 points, because the max points you could get before was like 24. And now we're at like 19. That's if you took like the bandit or whatever for each act, I think, right? It was like 21 plus 3, 1 for each set of bandits from normal, cruel, and merciless. And uh, now I think we're at like 17 skill points. And then if you add the 2 from the bandit quests, which you can either take a Lyra or do the bandit quest, either one is kind of like viable here. But you would get like 3 points from that, or 2 points from that, sorry. So you're at 19, and that's still 5 less than 24, which was the cap before. So I have a feeling we're going to get more skill point quests in Act 9 and 10. I don't think they would bring us lower than the amount of skill points we had before. Will they buff it? I'm not sure, but I doubt they'd go lower. So if you count those 5 skill points, then we basically fill this out at level 89, and we'd have all our health in fairly decent time. And then you would focus on maybe getting this other power charge. And then this would put you at 92. And then you could do like 93, 94. 95, 96, and you'd have a pretty strong character. You have 2 Jewel Sockets, you have 3 if you ended up just forsaking one of the first snows, especially if you went the Deadeye route, so you would have a substantial amount of health, probably close to like 5k, and then with a level 20 discipline and decent gear, like my gear is absolutely trash, you'd probably have easily over 2k ES, and then you'd easily have this amount of mana or more. So you actually have pretty solid defenses for a totem build, and given the freezing potential of the build. And then if you use the Pandemonious, you would also have blind on anything that's chilled. So I'm looking forward to testing that out. Um, in comparison to the other versions of this build, right? Because obviously you can still remake the Elementalist version, you can still remake the Inquis version, and you can do the Hierophant version. So how I'll put it is that this build is definitely the least maintenance that you have to do while playing the character, right? There's less buffs to keep up. Uh, the fact that you don't have to generate the charges like through any other method by just casting the totems is really helpful and is going to help keep you safe in very dangerous high-end maps. And you get essentially 5 additional skill points from playing Scion, um, and you get a decent amount. It's easier to get crit actually because you end up getting the assassin 1.5% base crit in addition to having the crit gem. So it's definitely easier to get crit, and it just seems pretty strong to me. When I sim it, it sims below Elementalist, um, and I believe below Inquisitor as well, but it's not like so far below, right? We're talking like maybe like 30k DPS, 40k DPS. Elementalist is still the highest sim value of DPS that I can get, and that's basically because the penetration stacking is so powerful. Because cold is an element that essentially has free pen that comes from Frostbomb. Not really every element has this. Like lightning doesn't really have it, I don't think. Fire has it, but it's kind of like annoying because you need to run a Searing Bond totem or a Scorching Ray totem, and you can't do that on a totem build because it takes up one of your totems. And if you self-cast it, then you're kind of just sitting there uh, looking to get wrecked. So that kind of defeats the purpose of even being a totem build in the first place. So, yeah, Frost is like the one with the true, just like free pen basically. Obviously, the Frost Bomb is stationary, so it can be kind of annoying on some bosses, but on a lot of the stronger bosses, they're relatively immobile, so it's a pretty decent option. And when you combine this pen with the Wise Oak pen, with the pen from the boots, and then the pen from the gem, it's and then the pen from the curse, then you just have a lot of damage there. Um, in terms of the curse, just to note, I believe that projectile weakness gives more flat out damage, but it's by a very small amount, and when you quality frostbite, the freeze duration, I believe it is, goes up. So I really do want to try playing with a 20 quality frostbite and just see like what bosses I can freeze. I'll probably do a video about that, and also I'll have the Pandemonious for that as well, and that'll probably be like the final test to see what we can really freeze. And maybe I'll make an Elementalist version of this just to see if we can still like what tier we can freeze up to with these types of builds, but probably won't be freezing the very end stuff as Scion because the max potential damage hits just aren't high enough. But yeah, so I'd say that if you're looking for pure damage, then Elementalist is by far the best. But uh, I really think that Scion is close enough to Elementalist where I'd much rather play the Scion version late game. The only real issue is that in the early game, Scion is a lot more of a pain in the ass to level because of the gems they get, and just like obviously you're trying to get the totems to play Flame Blast Totem, or you can do SRS, I guess, but I like playing Flame Blast Totem. But the problem is you're not really getting much damage on the way, so it's kind of annoying. If you're playing with friends at the start of the league, it's not really that big of a deal because you're gonna have access to more gems and stuff like that, and you can trade gear. So it can be taken with a grain of salt, but if you're going to start with solo play, Elementalist might be easier, like to help you get established and high on the ladder quicker. But at the end of the day, obviously, the first day of the race, like the first 4 or 5 hours of it, or whatever it takes to get to a high level, it's not really, it's only going to take that amount of time or a little bit more, right? So it's not the biggest deal in the scheme of things if it takes you a little bit longer to level a Scion. In terms of Inquisitor is, like, I'd say below Elementalist in terms of damage, like raw damage and freezing potential, but in terms of clear speed, it's, you could probably say it's a bit higher because of the Instruments of Virtue node. You get a lot of attack speed from that. You also get damage reduction from the aura thing that comes out around you. So Inquisitor is still a very viable option. Um, and it's not really that much of a pain if you're going to actually use Shield Charge or Whirling Blades as your movement skill with those. Like if you're gonna go Wands, I definitely wouldn't go Inquisitor because it just becomes a pain to proc Instruments of Virtue is the problem. And yeah, so it's like you're kind of, one of your buffs is just contingent on you always attacking with Frenzy, and it's a pretty substantial buff. But if you're gonna just use a attack-based movement skill, then it's very easy to get the benefit from instruments. So yeah, and as far as Hierophant goes, Hierophant is a great defensive option, but the thing is that the only way it generates charges is on kill, and the defense that it's providing you is not really substantially better, in my opinion, than Scion. Like, obviously, you get a little bit more mana and more ES from the mana, but it's not a huge amount. And I think the main thing about the Hierophant that's nice, really, is the reduction in the totem cost. Uh, but that's normally not a huge issue anyways. So it's kind of like you're shoring up a spot where there's really not even that much of a weakness. So I don't really like Hierophant, and playing Hierophant generally, unless I'm doing like some sort of race scenario where I know that a lot of people aren't going to be playing Hierophant, it's for a demi or something like that. Like in the past 2 races when I was thinking about playing them, I was considering Hierophant, but I ended up not playing them. So Hierophant's not like awful or anything, but it just doesn't really have the damage. And if you're gonna play it for the survivability, I feel like you might as well play Scion and get similar survivability, possibly even more when you factor in the extra points. And you just have the survivability on bosses of not having to worry about getting your charges up. And you can just focus on moving a lot more. Because you're always going to be able to sustain charges on bosses due to placing your totems. You can go into a boss fight actually as the Scion with full charges, because before something like Atziri, you could just cast down totems until you're at max power charge and then walk into the room or something like that. So yeah, I think Scion's just a much better option. I wouldn't really recommend playing Hierophant. Not terrible, but just doesn't bring anything to the table that the others don't already. Um, and yeah, Elemental is still your highest damage option. So I'll probably be doing, like I said, a video seeing if I have enough time to make an Elementalist, because I'm trying to do a bunch of other builds too, then I'll make an Elementalist version of this and just swap the gear over and see what I can freeze. But if not, we'll have to just see. I'm not really sure what I'll be playing come 3.0 launch. If I'll even be playing a totem build, it depends, because some of the content is quite rough, honestly. That's probably the last thing I want to talk about, is that just with the new boss HP system, you have to be a lot more careful on some of the boss fights, just something to keep in mind. And if you don't have beta access and you're looking to push hardcore at the start of 3.0, you should really look into getting beta access, I would say, because like obviously normally having the beta is always going to be an advantage, right? So it'd be kind of silly to suggest otherwise. But I think this time having the beta is a very significant advantage, because not only is the leveling content, it can be sort of challenging, and there's some one-shot mechanics or close to one-shot mechanics in some of the bosses that you wouldn't have experience with if you just kind of boot up 3.0 and go at it from the get-go, which could rip you. But also, once you get into maps, adjusting to the new boss HP is going to be a challenge if they decide to just keep this 100% buff flat. There's a lot of bosses before you could just freeze, like I said, and now you can't really freeze most of the bosses that are in the higher tiers of maps. You can still freeze the low tier ones. So it requires a lot more careful play. Something like a strand actually is a great example, like a shape strand. If you notice in the guide video I make, you do have to play somewhat carefully. I actually did kill the boss really quick, but you have to make sure you don't get hit by the blade flurry of Kritlin because it absolutely wrecks you. And if you have any damage mods on the map, it like wrecks you that much more. So if you run a strand with like boss damage and added damage and then like added its cold, and you sit in that blade flurry for even like a second or two, you're probably gonna rip. So it just takes, you just have to be careful on a lot of the boss fights, more so than before. And it's not something that's like impossible to play around, but depending on how they readjust the reward system, I'm not really sure if all the bosses are going to be worth doing. Stuff like the Strand boss is probably still fine in most cases, but if I had like really rippy mods on a Strand, I wouldn't do the boss because I know that I probably can't consistently freeze it now, unless maybe I do that Elementalist version with GG gear. And if I can't freeze it, then I'm not taking the chance of like getting clipped by Blade Flurry with those mods and like dying in like a tick or something, because the damage is just obscene, and you can't get like a super amount of defenses. They've actually nerfed your energy shield based defenses, so just something to keep in mind. But yes, this has been a really long video, but like I said, I did the quick version in the guide, so I don't really mind this being that long. So if you've made it all the way through, thanks for watching, I guess, and I hope you found it interesting and informative. And yeah, just hit the like button if you like the content. Obviously, if you have any criticism or questions or whatever, just feel free to leave them in the comments. I generally try and respond to them as quick as I can. And yeah, so I'll see you guys next time and have fun playing the beta.